Picture this. You're sitting in a sterile laboratory. In front of you is a machine with switches labeled from 15 volts all the way up to 450 volts, marked danger, severe shock. Through a window, you can see another person strapped to a chair, electrodes attached to their body. A man in a white coat tells you to flip the switch. The person screams. The authority figure says, "Continue." You hesitate, but you do it again and again until you've potentially killed someone. This isn't fiction. This was Stanley Milgram's 1961 experiment. And here's the part that'll mess with your head. 65% of ordinary people went all the way to the end. Teachers, mailmen, housewives, regular folks who thought they were decent human beings were willing to electrocute a stranger to death simply because someone in authority told them to. The kicker? The screaming person was an actor, but the participants didn't know that. They believed they were actually hurting someone, and they did it anyway. So here's the question that should keep you awake at night. How does a good person end up on the wrong side of history? Because if you think you're immune to becoming the villain in someone else's story, you're already halfway down a path you don't even realize you're walking. This isn't just psychology, it's a warning. And the most terrifying part? You might never see it coming. We love our fairy tales about good versus evil, don't we? The hero saves the day, the villain gets what's coming to them, and we sleep soundly knowing we'd never be the bad guy. But here's what they don't teach you in school. The most horrific acts in human history weren't committed by cartoon villains twirling mustaches. They were carried out by people just like you, regular people with jobs, families, and weekend hobbies who somehow found themselves participating in genocide, torture, and mass murder. Take the Holocaust. We're talking about millions of ordinary Germans who went to work every day, processing paperwork, operating trains, and following procedures that led to the systematic murder of 6 million people. These weren't psychopaths. Psychological studies showed most Nazi functionaries were disturbingly normal. Or look at Rwanda in 1994, where neighbors hacked neighbors to death with machetes. Teachers clubbed students. Priests mistered their congregations. Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. American soldiers, many of whom were model citizens back home, committed acts so disturbing that the photos still haunt us today. The uncomfortable truth is this: evil isn't some rare genetic defect that only shows up in a few twisted individuals. It's a capacity that exists in every single human being, including you. The only difference between you and history's monsters might just be circumstances you haven't encountered yet. But that wasn't the whole story. Researchers discovered something even more chilling. There's actually a predictable pattern to how good people become complicit in evil. They called it the corruption cycle. And it happens in 5 terrifying stages that most people never see coming. It's like a psychological trap that's been catching human beings for thousands of years. And once you understand how it works, you'll start seeing it everywhere. The cycle starts with moral erosion, tiny compromises that seem harmless but lower your ethical bar just a little bit each time. Then comes obedience to authority, where you start following orders that go against your better judgment. Stage 3 is group identity and tribalism, where loyalty to your team becomes more important than doing what's right. Stage 4 brings self-justification, where your mind starts rewriting reality to make your questionable actions seem noble. And finally, the last stage, dehumanization, where the people you're hurting stop being human in your mind. Here's what makes this cycle so dangerous. It doesn't happen overnight. It's gradual, subtle, and by the time you realize what's happening, you're already too far gone to easily turn back. Most people who get caught in this cycle never intended to become the bad guy. They were just trying to be good employees, loyal citizens, or team players. The first stage, moral erosion, starts with something psychologists call the foot in the door technique. Someone asks you to do something small that slightly bends your moral code. Maybe it's a tiny lie to a customer, or looking the other way when your boss does something questionable, or going along with a joke that's a bit too cruel. It feels insignificant at the time, like it doesn't really matter. But here's the scary part. Every time you make one of these small compromises, your brain adjusts, your moral threshold drops just a little bit. What felt wrong yesterday starts feeling normal today. It's like your conscience has a dimmer switch, and each compromise turns the lights down just a notch. Before you know it, you're operating in near darkness, doing things that would have horrified your former self. Take the Watergate scandal. It didn't start with a plan to bring down a presidency. It began with small lies, minor cover-ups, and incremental steps that each seemed reasonable at the time. Or look at Enron. Employees who started by slightly inflating numbers ended up participating in one of the biggest corporate frauds in history. They didn't wake up one morning and decide to steal billions. They just kept saying yes to the next small step. The terrifying reality is that most people never realize they're sliding down this slope until they're already at the bottom. And that brings us to the second stage of the corruption cycle. And this one's gonna make your blood run cold. Obedience to authority. This is where that Milgram experiment we started with becomes absolutely terrifying because it revealed something most people don't want to admit. We're hardwired to follow orders, even when those orders are completely insane. But the Milgram experiment was just the beginning. In 1971, Stanford University conducted what would become one of the most infamous psychological studies ever attempted. They turned the basement of the psychology building into a mock prison and randomly assigned college students to be either guards or prisoners. These were normal kids, honor students, future doctors and teachers, people you'd trust to babysit your children. Within 24 hours, the guards were already abusing their power. By day 6, the experiment had to be shut down because the psychological torture had become so severe that the lead researcher realized he was watching real cruelty unfold in real time. One guard later said he felt like he was in a movie where he was playing the bad guy, except he forgot he was acting. The authority of their assigned roles had transformed ordinary college kids into sadistic prison guards who seemed to enjoy inflicting psychological pain. Here's what's really messed up. When interviewed afterward, most of the guards said they were just doing their job and following the rules of the experiment. Sound familiar? It's the same defense used by Nazi war criminals, by soldiers who committed atrocities in Vietnam, and by corporate executives who've destroyed lives for profit. The magic words that let people sleep at night: I was just following orders. But that wasn't the whole story. The researchers discovered that authority doesn't even have to be legitimate to work. People will obey someone in a lab coat, uniform, or even just someone who acts like they're in charge. The authority figure doesn't need to threaten you. They just need to seem confident and official. Your brain does the rest, shutting down your moral reasoning and replacing it with compliance. Think about your own life for a second. How many times have you done something you weren't comfortable with because your boss, teacher, or some other authority figure told you to? How many times did you bite your tongue when you witnessed something wrong because speaking up might get you in trouble with someone higher up the food chain? That's the second stage working on you right now. The third stage is where things get really dangerous: group identity and tribalism. This is when your loyalty to your team becomes more important than your personal morals. And here's the kicker: it doesn't matter what the group is. Sports fans, political parties, religious organizations, companies, friend groups, online communities. Any group can become a vehicle for moral corruption if you let group loyalty override your individual conscience. Psychologists proved this with something called minimal group experiments, and the results are absolutely wild. They took random people and divided them into groups based on completely meaningless criteria, like whether they preferred paintings by Kandinsky or Klee, or even just by flipping a coin. Within minutes, people started favoring their own group members and discriminating against the other group over nothing. Literally nothing. Now imagine what happens when the stakes are real, when your job depends on team loyalty, when your social status is tied to group membership, when your identity becomes so wrapped up in being part of something that you'd rather do horrible things than risk being kicked out. This is how genocides happen. It starts with propaganda that creates an us versus them mentality. The other group becomes the enemy, not individual human beings with their own stories and families, but a faceless threat to everything you hold dear. In Rwanda, a radio broadcast convinced Hutus that Tutsis were cockroaches that needed to be exterminated. In Nazi Germany, Jews were portrayed as rats spreading disease. In America, we've seen this same language used against various groups throughout our history. But here's what's truly chilling. You don't need a dictator or propaganda minister to activate tribal thinking. Social media does it automatically. Every time you share a post that demonizes the other side, every time you refuse to listen to a different perspective because it comes from them, every time you let political or cultural identity determine your moral positions, you're feeding stage 3 of the corruption cycle. The group becomes your moral compass. If the group says something is right, then it's right, even if it contradicts everything you used to believe. If the group says someone deserves punishment, then they deserve it, even if you don't know what they actually did. The group's enemies become your enemies. The group's victims? Well, they probably had it coming. This stage is particularly insidious because it feels good. Belonging to a group gives you purpose, identity, and protection. It makes you feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself. Fighting for your team releases the same chemicals in your brain as falling in love. No wonder people get addicted to the tribal mindset. It's literally a natural high. But that euphoric feeling of belonging comes with a price. Every group demands conformity. Every tribe requires enemies. And once you've committed to seeing the world through your group's eyes, You're no longer making moral decisions as an individual. You're just following the crowd, even if that crowd is heading straight off a cliff. The fourth stage makes everything even worse. The fourth stage makes everything even worse because this is where your brain becomes your worst enemy: self-justification and moral licensing. This is the point where your mind starts rewriting reality to make you the hero of your own story, no matter how terrible your actions actually are. Here's how it works. Once you've done something questionable, your brain faces a choice: admit you screwed up and feel terrible about yourself, or find a way to justify what you did so you can keep feeling like a good person. Guess which option wins almost every time? Your mind becomes a master storyteller, spinning elaborate narratives about why your horrible actions were actually noble, necessary, or even heroic. The concentration camp guard tells himself he's protecting his country from dangerous enemies. The corporate executive who covers up deadly defects convinces herself she's protecting thousands of jobs. The police officer who plants evidence believes he's putting a dangerous criminal where they belong. The politician who lies to start a war genuinely believes he's spreading freedom and democracy. They're not lying to you. They're lying to themselves so effectively that they actually believe their own bullshit. But here's the really twisted part. Once you've done one terrible thing and justified it, it becomes easier to do the next terrible thing. Psychologists call this moral licensing. The idea that past good behavior gives you permission to act badly in the future. Did something charitable last week? Great, now you can be cruel today and still feel like a good person overall. It's like your brain keeps a moral credit score, and as long as you're not completely in the red, you can keep making withdrawals. This stage is particularly dangerous because it makes people feel righteous about their worst impulses. They're not just doing evil, they're doing necessary evil. They're making the hard choices that weak people can't make. They're warriors for justice, protectors of the innocent, defenders of the greater good. The more horrible their actions, the more noble they feel for having the strength to do what others won't. And that brings us to the fifth and final stage, the one that makes mass atrocities possible: dehumanization. This is when the people you're hurting stop being human in your mind. They become objects, statistics, problems to be solved rather than individual human beings with their own hopes, fears, and families. The language always changes first. Jews became vermin in Nazi Germany. Tutsis became cockroaches in Rwanda. Enemies become targets in military operations. Homeless people become problems in city planning meetings. Once you stop using human language to describe humans, it becomes shockingly easy to treat them as less than human. Your empathy literally shuts off. Brain scans show that when people view members of dehumanized groups, the areas of the brain associated with empathy and emotional processing go dark. These aren't broken people or psychopaths. They're ordinary humans whose brains have been rewired by the dehumanization process. The neural pathways that normally make you feel compassion for suffering simply don't activate when looking at people you've been taught to see as subhuman. This is how ordinary people end up participating in genocide. This is how prison guards torture inmates. This is how soldiers commit war crimes. This is how online mobs destroy lives without a second thought. Once dehumanization takes hold, cruelty doesn't just become possible, it starts feeling justified, even righteous. But that wasn't the end of the story. The most important question isn't how people fall into this cycle. It's whether they can escape it, and the answer might surprise you. Yes, but only if you're willing to do something most people find incredibly uncomfortable. Question yourself constantly and acknowledge that you might be wrong about almost everything. The antidote to the corruption cycle is radical self-awareness. You have to become obsessed with monitoring your own moral drift. Every time you make a small compromise, you have to recognize it and ask yourself where it leads. Every time an authority figure asks you to do something that feels wrong, you have to have the courage to say no. Every time your group starts demonizing outsiders, you have to remember that the people they're targeting are human beings just like you. You have to actively cultivate empathy, especially for people you disagree with or dislike. You have to question your own narratives and assumptions. You have to be willing to admit when you're wrong and change course, even when it's embarrassing or costly. Most importantly, you have to remember that good intentions aren't enough. History is littered with atrocities committed by people who thought they were doing the right thing. The uncomfortable truth is that every single person listening to this has the capacity for evil. You're not special. You're not immune. Given the right circumstances, the right pressures, and the right justifications, you could become complicit in terrible things. The only question is whether you'll recognize the signs before it's too late. So here's your final challenge. Now that you know how the cycle works, will you be strong enough to break it when it starts working on you? Or will you become just another ordinary person who ended up on the wrong side of history, wondering how the hell you got there? The choice is yours. But remember, thinking you're too good to fall is exactly how the fall begins.